All right, folks, welcome back. Tonight, we need to talk about something that's been going on for a while, but nobody in the mainstream media wants to cover it because, frankly, it requires opening a history book. We're going all the way back to ancient China. I'm talking about the Warring States period, 475 to 221 BC. Now, imagine a country completely fractured into 7 major kingdoms, all tearing each other apart for ultimate power. It was absolute chaos. You had the Qin, the Chu, the Zhao, basically a bunch of elite rulers who couldn't agree on anything. Sound familiar? Except back then, instead of arguing on cable news, they were sending hundreds of thousands of chariots and infantry to wipe each other out. It was a brutal, centuries-long reality show where the stakes were survival, and the weak got absolutely crushed. Traditional rules of chivalry flown right out the window. It was total war, driven by cutthroat politics, massive military drafts, and some of the most ruthless strategies the world has ever seen. But here's the kicker. While these states were busy plotting each other's downfall, this era actually birthed the golden age of Chinese philosophy. We're talking Confucianism, legalism, Taoism, intellectual heavyweights trying to figure out how to fix a broken system. Ultimately, it wasn't the philosophers who won. It was the Qin state. They stopped playing nice, adopted a brutal law and order philosophy, and systematically conquered every single rival. By 221 BC, the king of Qin declared himself the first emperor of a unified China, drawing the curtain on centuries of bloody division. It just goes to show you, when the establishment crumbles and chaos takes over, whoever has the smartest strategy and the toughest resolve walks away with the whole kingdom. And you know what the crazy part is? Once this guy, Qin Shi Huang, took the crown, he didn't just sit back and enjoy the win. No, he went full bureaucratic control freak. We are talking about the ultimate top-down federal overreach. He looked at the map and said, all right, new rules. Everyone uses the same currency, everyone uses the same weights and measures, and you're all going to write the exact same way. He literally standardized the entire civilization overnight. If you thought modern regulations were tough, this guy was burning books and burying scholars alive just to keep people from questioning his narrative. Talk about canceling the opposition. But he didn't stop there. He looked up at the northern border and saw a migrant crisis brewing with the nomadic tribes, the Xiongnu. So what did he do? He built a wall. Sound familiar? He connected a bunch of old, broken-down state walls and turned them into the first version of the Great Wall of China. It was a massive, expensive, grueling infrastructure project that put hundreds of thousands of people to work, or rather, forced them to work until they dropped. Now, you'd think a guy who conquered 7 kingdoms and built a massive wall would feel pretty secure. But deep down, he was terrified. The man was obsessed with living forever. He sent fleets of ships out into the ocean looking for a mythical elixir of life. He was popping mercury pills because his doctors told him it would make him immortal. Spoilers, it didn't. It actually poisoned him. And when he finally bit the dust in 210 BC, he didn't just go out quietly. He took an entire clay army with him. He had thousands of life-size terracotta warriors buried in his tomb, fully armed and ready to fight for him in the afterlife. Talk about a massive ego. But here's the ultimate punchline of history. After all that brutal control, all that fighting, and all those walls, the Qin dynasty didn't even last 15 years. The second he was gone, the people revolted. The system collapsed, and a new dynasty took over. Turns out you can conquer an empire with iron fists and absolute censorship, but you can't build a lasting legacy on pure tyranny. Stay tuned because we've got a lot more history to expose right after the break. So the brutal Qin dynasty goes down in flames, and you're probably thinking, all right, lesson learned, time for some peace and quiet, right? Wrong. Because in the vacuum of that collapse, we got the ultimate historical heavyweight matchup, the Western Chu versus the Han. This was a classic clash of egos. On one side, you had Xiang Yu, a towering aristocratic warlord who was basically the ultimate alpha male of his day. On the other side, you had Liu Bang, a peasant-born, low-level official who wasn't the greatest fighter, but man, did he know how to play the political game. It was the elites versus the working class, and for 4 long years, they tore the country apart, trying to claim the ultimate prize. Ultimately, the charismatic peasant outsmarted the arrogant aristocrat, and by 202 BC, Liu Bang officially launched the Han Dynasty. Now, this wasn't just a change in leadership. This was a complete rebranding of China. The Han looked at the Qin's brutal, canceled culture playbook and said, let's tone it down a notch. They embraced Confucianism, bringing back family values, tradition, and a merit-based bureaucracy. They realized you catch more flies with honey than with mercury pills and mass executions. And guess what? It worked. The Han Dynasty became such a golden age that even today, the dominant ethnic group in China still calls themselves the Han people. They expanded trade, established the Silk Road, and connected the East to the West, making ancient China an economic superpower. But you know the rules of history by now. Nothing stays golden forever. Fast forward a few centuries, and the Han government got bloated, corrupt, and completely out of touch. Sound familiar? The emperors started ignoring the hardworking taxpayers and listening to corrupt court insiders instead. Add in a few massive floods, failing crops, and a massive tax burden on the working class, and the people finally said, enough is enough. By 184 AD, a massive peasant rebellion called the Yellow Turban Rebellion exploded across the country. These weren't political activists writing angry letters. They were millions of furious citizens wearing yellow headbands, ready to tear down the establishment. The Han government panicked, lost total control, and had to rely on independent regional warlords to put down the uprising. And folks, once you give local warlords that kind of military power, they don't just hand it back. The central government completely dissolved into chaos, setting the stage for 3 massive rival kingdoms to carve up the map all over again. The cycle of power, corruption, and absolute collapse just keeps on spinning. And that brings us to the Three Kingdoms period, which is basically the ultimate high-stakes game of political chess in human history. The Han Empire is completely dead in the water, and 3 massive egos step up to carve up the map. You had Cao Cao in the north, a brilliant, ruthless military mastermind who basically pioneered the concept of rules for thee, but not for me. In the west, you had Liu Bei, a guy who claimed he was for the people, always preaching about honor and loyalty, while secretly plotting his next land grab. And down in the south, you had Sun Quan, a young, wealthy legacy kid who controlled the naval trade and refused to let anyone else on his turf. For decades, these 3 states waged absolute psychological and military warfare. We're talking about legendary showdowns like the Battle of Red Cliffs, where a massive, elite Northern army got completely outsmarted and burned to a crisp on the Yangtze River by a coalition of underdogs. The mainstream narrative wants you to think this was an era of pure romance and heroism. But let's look at the actual data. The constant warfare, plagues, and economic collapse wiped out nearly 70% of the population. It was an absolute humanitarian disaster brought to you by warlords who refused to compromise. Eventually, after all that bloodshed, none of the original three factions even won the game. While they were busy fighting each other, a sneaky, powerful insider family called the Sima clan was quietly infiltrating the northern government. They pulled off a classic deep state coup, hijacked the military, and by 280 AD, they conquered all three exhausted kingdoms, rebranding the whole thing as the Jin Dynasty. But if you think this story has a happy, stable ending, you haven't been paying attention. The Jin Dynasty was so dysfunctional and corrupt from day one that it lasted about 5 minutes before the whole country fractured into even worse chaos, the 16 Kingdoms era. For the next few centuries, China became a revolving door of short-lived regimes, nomadic invasions, and non-stop civil war. It turns out when you destroy the foundational values of a society and replace them with pure, unadulterated power grabs, you don't get stability. You get a centuries-long reality check. But don't go anywhere, because the rise, the fall, and the ultimate comeback of the next great dynasty is coming up right after this. So, China is completely broken, fractured into a million pieces for over 300 years. And the experts at the time are saying, it's over. The country is permanently divided. But then, right around 581 AD, a tough-as-nails general named Yang Jian steps up, cracks some heads, and pulls off the ultimate political comeback. He founds the Sui dynasty and completely reunifies the nation. Now, this guy was a visionary, but he was also a brutal taskmaster. He looked at the map and realized the booming agricultural south and the political powerhouse north weren't connected. So what did he do? He forced millions of peasants to dig the Grand Canal, the longest man-made river in the world. It was an engineering marvel that completely revolutionized domestic trade, but the human cost was staggering. The working class was pushed to the absolute brink, taxed into oblivion, and drafted into disastrous foreign wars. The people finally had enough of the big government tyranny, and after just 2 emperors, the Sui dynasty went up in flames. But out of those ashes rose what historians call the ultimate superpower era, the Tang dynasty, founded in 618 AD. If the Qin and Sui were the brutal, iron-fisted regimes, the Tang were the masters of prosperity and global influence. They set up their capital in Chang'an, which became the absolute center of the world, a massive cosmopolitan metropolis where traders from Rome, Persia, and India all came to do business. This was the era of Chang'an elite culture, incredible poetry, and massive economic growth. They created a system where even a regular kid from the provinces could take a civil service exam and rise to the top of the government based on merit, not just family connections. And you can't talk about the Tang without talking about Wu Zetian, the only official female emperor in Chinese history. The mainstream media today loves a glass ceiling story. But Wu Zetian didn't just break the ceiling, she shattered it with a sledgehammer. She started as a low-level concubine, used absolute ruthless political genius to outmaneuver the entire imperial court, and took the throne for herself. She purged the corrupt old aristocrats, looked out for the peasantry, and ran the empire with an iron fist wrapped in a silk glove. For over a century, the Tang dynasty was absolutely unstoppable. They controlled the Silk Road, accumulated massive wealth, and projected power across all of Asia. But just like every other elite establishment in history, they got complacent. The rulers started spending more time enjoying the luxury of the palace and listening to flattering court insiders rather than managing the borders. And in 755 AD, A massive, trusted military insider named An Lushan looked at the bloated, out-of-touch government and decided it was time to launch a coup. That rebellion absolutely rocked the empire to its core, dragging the Golden Age into a dark, bloody spiral. It's the same old story, folks. When the elites get drunk on their own success and ignore the warning signs, the fall is always catastrophic. We've got more on how this superpower tried to save itself right after the break. The An Lushan rebellion completely guts the Tang dynasty. And folks, it was an absolute bloodbath. We're talking about a civil war so massive that historians estimate it wiped out a staggering chunk of the global population at the time. The imperial court actually had to beg foreign mercenaries to come in and save their skin. Sure, the Tang technically survived the uprising, but the magic was gone. The central government was completely toothless. Regional military governors stopped paying their taxes, and the currency went into a total tailspin. By 907 AD, the whole thing completely disintegrated, plunging China right back into another 50 years of absolute chaos called the Five Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms period. It was just a non-stop, chaotic game of musical chairs, with warlords grabbing power one day and getting assassinated the next. But then, around 960 AD, the adults finally enter the room. A clever general named Zhao Kuang-yin pulls off a classic bloodless coup. His own troops literally wrap him in an imperial yellow robe while he's asleep and say, "Congrats, you're the boss now." He founds the Song dynasty, and he looks at the history books and says, "All right, no more military dictators running the show." He convinces his top generals to retire with massive pensions and completely